The issue of terrorist use of the internet, the dark web, encrypted messaging applications and so on, very, very relevant by the mid-March, the end of March 2017, because of a couple of developments. One was obviously the attack on the Houses of Parliament in the UK, following which the Home Secretary Amber Rudd called for greater government access to encryption devices and encrypted messaging systems. We also had the offensive in Mosul against the Islamic State, and for the first time we saw the wide-scale deployment by the Islamic State of UAVs which were weaponized, which were actually carrying improvised explosive devices to drop on troops and on armor. So for a long time there's been this tension between privacy and surveillance, between the government, who obviously wants to know what's going on the internet and on the dark web, and the terrorists who are trying to find new platforms to avoid that happening. Now, I think there are two main areas that we're looking at. One is the dark web itself, which is inaccessible to normal search engines, and one is encrypted messaging platforms. So just to recap, the dark web itself is a series of communication nodes which the likes of Google and so on cannot access. You need normally to access it via a specialist package such as Tor or I2P. And on the dark web you have all sorts of illegal activity, which includes cryptocurrency trading, pornography, drugs and arms trafficking and so on. And on the screen now is a screenshot of various activity on the dark web. The second area that we're looking at is encrypted messaging as well. Lots and lots of apps out there now which can be used for secure communications. A lot of this is not new. A lot of the products have been there for several years. They include commercially available products which have been used by terrorists for communications and for planning, such as the Tails operating system. And they also include bespoke systems which the terrorists themselves have developed to answer their particular needs. So on the screen now is a sample selection of various dark spaces out there on the internet and on the dark web. These include operating systems, messaging apps, browsers, virtual machines, and all sorts of other ways that terrorists and criminals can seek to avoid online surveillance. Now, markedly, in the last few years, a number of governments have become very cognizant of the exact nature of the threat, and they have stepped up their activities against both terrorists, insurgents, criminals on the internet. The UK, US governments in particular have been quite proactive with this. They've openly declared cyber warfare against the Islamic State. In particular, I think it's also worth highlighting it's not just the Islamic State we're talking about, it's also groups such as Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, Hezbollah to a lesser extent, and also far-right groups are also coming to the attention of the authorities increasingly. Although it's fair to say that with far-right groups, I think they like their message to be propagated openly, so their activity in the darker spaces of the internet is probably less. So, in particular, for example, the US has, under its ATA program, it's provided greater dark web training to its partners. There's been a lot of activity in terms of developing new search engines, such as DARPA's Memex, which aims to actually go through the darker recesses of the internet and actually be able to find some of the content that previously was not available. So those are the sorts of initiatives that governments appear to be taking at the moment, although obviously this is a constant and evolving battle. Looking to the future, there are a number of likely developments in this ongoing battle between the terrorists and between government. We can see, for example, that terrorists would also make wide use of anti-forensic software so that in the event that their computers were actually seized, they could try to obfuscate their tracks and stay one step ahead of the government that way. There are a number of other developments, I think, that are perhaps likely. One is that there's been a lot of law enforcement and intelligence focus on Tor, which is the browser bundle used most routinely to access the dark web. There are other options, such as I2P and Freenet, for accessing parts of the darknet. And we've seen some indication that there are mirrored sites on networks such as I2P. These obviously might come to greater prominence if terrorists and criminals were to start thinking that the risk of going onto the dark web via Tor was too great. So that's one potential development. Looking even further into the future, we've talked a lot about encryption and how encryption is largely unbreakable at the moment. That's the standard encryption that's being used in messaging apps such as Telegram. A future development is likely to be in quantum cryptography and quantum key distribution. This would potentially offer something which would be genuinely uncrackable, and I think that is the sort of development that intelligence agencies, particularly working in the SIGINT field, will be looking at very closely now to make sure that they have the systems in place. What's certain is that there's a vast amount of data out there. Terrorists, criminals are generating this data daily. Often they can hide in plain sight, and it's a question of the resources which agencies are able to actually dedicate to the problem. So I think we can say with some certainty that this is a cat and mouse game that's going to last for quite some time.